Good evening, everyone. Apologies for our slight technical hitches there. That was my fault. Welcome again to our In Conversation event this week with Catherine Bertola and Marianne McQuay. My name is Miles Thurlow, and I'm the co-founder of Workplace Foundation, which is set up by to support emerging and represented artists based in the north of England. This evening we'll be hosting the second in a series of In Conversations, which we'll be hosting every Tuesday at 8 p.m. And I'd like to thank all of you who registered for last week's postponed event for your patience and understanding. We felt that it was really important for us to pause our programme in solidarity with Blackout Tuesday. We hope that you will join us next week for the rescheduled conversation with Magnus Quaife and Andy Hunt. This week, artist Catherine Bertola will be in conversation with Marianne McQuay. Catherine Bertola is a visual artist whose practice encompasses installation, drawing, photographic and film works that respond to specific sites, collections and historic contexts. Her work explores the way the passing of time becomes inscribed and materialised in the things around us, as well as issues around authenticity in relation to contemporary perceptions and consumption of history, often focusing on the historic role of women in society, the home, craft, production and labour. Past works have involved producing commission works for institutions such as MAD New York, V&A London, Bronte Parsonage Museum, Haworth, Crafts Council, Government Art Collection and several National Trust properties across the UK. Marianne McQuay, guest international curator for Wales in Venice 2019 with artist Sean Edwards, has been head of programme at Bluecoat, Liverpool since November 2014. She's currently on furlough, I should say. Recent solo exhibitions and projects at Bluecoat include commissioning new works by Larissa Sansur, Adhem Faramawi, Elaine Michener, Jade Montserrat, Jonathan Baldock, Francis Disley and Grace Nduritu. Apologies for my pronunciation there. Previously, she was curator at Spike Island, Bristol, 2007 to 2013, working with artists including Elizabeth Price, Laura Provost, Can Alte, Sonia Boyce, Melissa Gordon, Sean Edwards, Amanda Beach, James Richards and Jessie Jones. As with the last time, we'll have time at the end for questions. If you could use your chat function to send them through, I'll read them at the end. Without further ado, welcome Catherine Bertola. She should appear magically, hopefully. And welcome, oh, here we go, there's Catherine. Hi, Catherine.
Hi.
And I'm just trying to unmute and start. Okay, Marianne should appear as well. Marianne, you have to unmute.
Done it.
There we go, there we go. Okay, thank you very much. I will disappear, thank God, and hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. And hi, Catherine, how are you doing?
Hi. I'm fine, thank you. Yes, it's quite strange knowing that there's lots of people watching, but I can only see you.
We're going to just pretend it's a chat amongst ourselves, it'll be fine. Yeah. So, no, I'm really pleased to do this, and this could have been happening in Leeds, or where a project is we're going to talk about, but it's, yes, I'm in Liverpool and you are in?
Blaydon, which is south of the River Tyne.
And at any point our children may run in, or we get a FaceTime call from the in-laws or anything, so we're primed for this to go on. But no, I'm really, really delighted. I've followed your work actually for about 20 years, because you and I have been artist and curator for about the same kind of period, so it's really a privilege to be able to have a conversation with you. We decided to start with, between us, a new project of yours called Below the Salt, which, like so many projects that we're launching in spring, paused at the point it would have launched. So many projects didn't launch, many launched for a few days, some have been completely cancelled. We thought Below the Salt was a way into your work because it has some of the ways that you work historically, and then a very new piece. I wondered if, as we play some images in a film that's very key, if you would just mind introducing very briefly what we're looking at and where it's set.
Okay, so Below the Salt is a an exhibition that was made for Temple Newsam House, which is just on the outskirts of Leeds. It's run by Leeds Museums. It's a Tudor Jacobean mansion, which celebrated its 500-year anniversary this year. And that was one of the sort of starting points for developing the work. It isn't like I've done a lot of work in the past in lots of National Trust properties where you get a really, you're really like walking through someone's kind of family home. You're very much aware of the sort of family history. And Temple Newsam was sold to Leeds City Council in 1920 and stripped out of all its kind of the objects that were the furniture and the objects, and subsequently was used by Leeds City Council as a contemporary art gallery. It was a hospital during the Second World War, and its recent kind of function is as the houses it's the city's decorative arts collection, which is a really extensive decorative arts collection. So it's kind of quite a sort of hybrid place in that it's kind of a historic building, and it houses lots of historic objects, but the narratives of those two things aren't sort of necessarily tied together. So what you don't get is this kind of story of how people lived there. It's there a little bit, but a lot of it's really more about the kind of objects that are within the property. So I was invited to make some work that kind of sort of looked at the history of the building, alongside, you know, because it was this kind of 500-year quite significant anniversary of the building. And the starting point for the project was really an inventory. There was an inventory made in the year that the house was built, in 1520, that's housed in the National Archives, and someone's worked for the last 10 years, a curator, Adam White, has worked on translating that inventory. And it was kind of quite an interesting document. It's a very sort of humble, modest document, but it's just quite interesting in that it just kind of lists all the objects that were in the house in that very sort of first year of its kind of existence. And so for me, that was kind of sort of starting point for thinking about, well, who else has lived in this property and how has this property been occupied over the course of its kind of history? And that was kind of where the project began.
And I think what we're watching at the moment, because the project has different manifestations, there's a floor piece, a partly completed sculpture, but we're watching a film piece that's about 6 minutes, that's shot in, it's in the kind of lower areas of the building.
Yeah, so there's a tunnel that connects two wings of the property, the north and south wing, and it wasn't an original. It was built in the sort of 19th century, and was really built to kind of, I suppose, like most kind of Victorian kind of adaptations were kind of really about efficiency. It was kind of like about making, transporting kind of coal and water and linen and food and etc. around the building sort of quickly and efficiently. And there's all sorts of these kind of hidden passageways in the building, and I was kind of really interested in using them in some way. I was kind of, I suppose I was sort of quite in really sort of fascinated in this sort of idea that there's another way around the building, that you're presented with this one kind of way of walking through and round a space that's very polished and finished, and yet often in between the walls and are these kind of passageways where servants, people that work there would have kind of travelled and would have kind of operated sort of kind of discreetly and quickly, and really that's they're the kind of like the arteries of these buildings. Part of my research was looking at, I went to the West Yorkshire Archives and became really fascinated in the quantities of coal that were ordered for the building, and just thinking like, how on earth did they carry these kind of tons of coal around, you know, to all the different rooms in the house? And it, you know, this sort of, it was through these kind of hidden passageways, you know, there's a kind of machinery there that kind of keeps these buildings functioning. And I guess I was kind of interested in exploring that machinery, I suppose, really, that invisible kind of machinery of the the building. So
and did it come to you very early on in your research that this would be a filmed performance, which is, it's a film that it's a film that's 6 minutes that you watch, so the performance is filmed specifically for camera, and that's a kind of new way of working for you. Did that come to you quite early on, or was it kind of treading the building that you thought about that kind of navigation?
I think for me there was something about the experience I had when I was walking around those spaces, I think, that I was maybe interested in revealing, and the sort of sense of I was quite interested in the kind of sense of repetition and that sort of endlessness. And I've done a lot of work in the past where I've looked at, done a lot of research into sort of cookbooks and domestic manuals, particularly produced in the Victorian period, that sort of describe the kind of like routines and daily rituals that servants should undertake. And there's a sense of this sort of endless drudgery and work and labour that's just kind of endless. And I suppose I kind of sometimes feel a little bit like that myself, even now, this kind of like sort of endless kind of endless laundry, endless cleaning, endless tidying up that kind of goes with a house that people live in. So I think my work, I've always sort of thought my work is a little bit performative. It's not, would never describe it as performance, but I think for me, when I'm making the work, I feel that there's very much a kind of relationship between what I'm doing physically within a space. And I've always seen that as being quite performative in a way. And so I suppose it didn't feel like a massive leap to kind of bring in other people to kind of almost as a sort of proxy for me in some way, to sort of explore this space in a physical way.
And we were talking about how, as a piece, and it's available to watch online, isn't it? You can kind of see it on the site, that you were not aiming for historical kind of reenactment, that you chose dance artists who might be using gesture and pacing to kind of mark out time and bodies. Now, it's a moment when lots of dance artists are crossing over to galleries again, and then the other way where visual artists are working with dance artists. So I just was really interested in who you brought on board to do that and how you came to that process.
So I worked with a choreographer called Jerry Turvey, and she's based in Leeds, and she sort of sourced the dancers. So it's really, so I suppose, she was kind of, I suppose, my relationship was primarily with Jerry, I guess, and it was kind of about how I talked to her about what I was kind of trying to do. And the reason I worked with Jerry is because she'd done quite a lot of work in, there was a piece particularly that I remember I saw of hers that I just immediately thought, you're going to know what I'm kind of doing, I'm interested in, where she was working in the library at Leeds and just exploring it as a space. And I think, I suppose there's sort of two things that I was kind of interested with the film. There was one, it was kind of interested in the space it was almost about the space and the physical. There's sort of a lot of my work deals with the surface of space and is about, and I suppose I was kind of interested in that, in the relationship between the dancers and the space and how they would work with the space. But I was also interested in it being quite pedestrian, so I didn't want it to be, I wanted it to be about walking and repeating and passing. And I was kind of thinking about like jobs that I've had, where you're kind of, when you're working, you just kind of, you kind of learn sort of movements that you just do intuitively and instinctively in a space because you've done them so many times. And I suppose I was thinking about those kind of, the way your body kind of moves around other people in certain environments. And so I suppose those are the kind of things that I was kind of thinking about. And I guess it was kind of in a way a bit of an abstract conversation with the choreographer, but I suppose it was a kind of feeling and a sense of, there was kind of, I suppose, a language that we came up with to talk about that space and what I was trying to achieve within it, I suppose.
No, definitely. And I think you get that sense of bodies passing each other and motion circulating and time kind of circulating with bodies. So no, it's a really, really beautiful beautiful work. It must have been quite difficult to shoot, just thinking about the pragmatics of being in a confined space. Actually, you get that sense very well, but I just was interested what it was like, because artist film shoots are never, you know, like, it's a very in-out kind of situation where you have to get what you need. I just wondered how it was like shooting down in that kind of tiny kind of corridor.
It was quite difficult. So I worked with Northern Film School. Again, it was kind of through doing the Lever Hume Trust residency that I did, is because Northern Film School is part of Leeds Beckett University. So I knew that they worked in sort of independent projects. So I contacted them, and they came on board, which was like really brilliant, because it meant that I could do so much more with my budget than I probably would have done otherwise, because they have access to lots of kit, and I worked with members of the staff, sort of took lead on direction and post-production as well, but they used their students to sort of film and work on set. So it was kind of, I managed to make, like, I wouldn't have been able to, if I'd have had to go and kind of find those kind of, that sort of crew, and on my own, I wouldn't have been able to do it, basically. So it was a really good way of kind of making that, the money I had, kind of go further. And in a way, I mean, I've never really worked on a film before. Well, so yeah, I've never produced a film in this way before. So I have produced film works, but they've been made very differently. But I suppose I have worked on film sets before. My partner makes films, so I've kind of got a lot of experience of being on set. So I sort of had an understanding of how the mechanics of a film production work. And I mean, it was really tricky, but I think because what I was after was quite, in a way, quite, I didn't want anything too complicated. I wanted it to be quite straightforward. It was about the bodies in the space. So there was, so it didn't need to kind of have lots of fancy lighting. It just needed to be quite sort of direct. But it was quite a condensed process. So the choreographer and dancers only worked together for like a couple of days to devise the sequences, and then we shot in about a day and a half. And yeah, we just did work very quickly. And I was just very lucky that I had quite a good team of people working with me, to be honest, as well.
And I was just, because it's this this very strange time when I can watch the film, but it has never been installed back on site because everything stopped just before the project had been realised. There's other works within this this Below the Salt series, and some might be more familiar to kind of people who've followed your work, where you have worked either with the kind of detritus of a space or the materials implied within a space. I wasn't sure maybe if Miles might run some images, if that might be possible, where you describe some of the other pieces. And also there is one piece that is incomplete because it needs to be made on site. So you might talk about how strange it is to be in this kind of partly realised moment. But I just was really interested in the floor piece, which I think would be quite a familiar mode for a lot of people, a very, very beautiful floor piece.
Yeah, so this is the sort of, the title of this work is Below the Salt, and that became the title of the exhibition. And Below the Salt was a phrase that was sort of originated from dining. So when this house was first built 500 years ago, this is the Great Hall, and the Great Hall was essentially a dining room. And there would have been a top table at the back of the room that you see here, and then tables would have run along from that. And in that period of time, salt was a really valuable, expensive commodity, and only certain people were allowed to access and have salt on their food. And so it became a delineation of hierarchy. And I suppose a lot of the work that I was making for the exhibition was interested in this sense of hierarchy and how hierarchy is expressed in Temple Newsam through the use of materials and through the architecture as well. So I suppose the film was looking at the kind of way hierarchy is expressed in the architectural spaces of the building. So I was kind of fascinated by this idea of salt, which is such a kind of commonplace material, really cheap now to have, was this kind of really material of value. So I wanted to sort of make something with salt, and because part of my research, I spent quite a lot of time just looking at the collections that are housed in at Temple Newsam, and they have quite an extensive textile collection, and I just spent a long time looking through their textiles, and they have this really quite interesting collection of very early table linen. And so the pattern that you see is this, it's taken from, it's the sort of the warp and weft, the design of a very early tablecloth. And so it was almost quite a straightforward kind of, oh, I'm going to make this tablecloth on the floor using salt. And so that's essentially what you're looking at now, is this kind of pattern of this.
Is that there now on site?
No, so it was made in January, so I made it over about 3 weeks, and then it was swept away.
Yeah.
But I took photographs of the installation, and what I was quite interested in this with this project was, I mean, I make a lot of site-specific installations like this, and I kind of really enjoy the fact that they do disappear, that they kind of come and go, and that's kind of part of them. But also I'm very aware as an artist that that doesn't leave me with much stuff. So I was kind of wanting to think of how I could make work that sort of resonates in a site and is part of the site, but that can maybe have a kind of life beyond that as well. So I was quite interested in the idea of sort of creating a kind of artifact, I suppose, or something that would last, would exist independently and beyond the space. And in all my previous installations, photographs have always been documentary. They've always just been documenting the work. And I've always been very clear about that. But what I found, I was sort of thinking about how could I make this work kind of have a longer sort of lasting presence in the world. And then I was reading about very early photographic processes, and there was the salt and silver technique, where you make prints using paper soaked in salt that's then coated in silver nitrate, and that's how you create a kind of photographic image. And it just seemed to make sense that, I can make photographs of this installation using the salt that it's been made from. And that's the work that then is shown in the exhibition. It's a series of images of the work, but that are made using the kind of salt that was made to use the installation that they're documenting. So there's a kind of sort of material kind of integrity to the work and the connection with the original piece. So this is one of the salt prints you're seeing. Yeah.
And I just was thinking about your use of materials, because as you were saying, you've worked in historic sites that have a very particular resonance, but you've also worked in a tower block, you've worked from sort of everyday abandoned wallpaper, you've used kind of lacy tights, I think, if I'm right, that have or
yeah, they're more drawings rather than sort of work, but yeah.
But I was interested in a kind of use that I've seen in your work of dust, and there's a very beautiful quote you sent me from an academic, is it Carolyn Steedman?
Carolyn Steedman, yeah.
Yeah, who around that we think of dust as being kind of the leftover, but actually it's effectively all around us. It's the stuff of matter. But I just would be interested if you talk about some of those other materials you've worked with and their sort of quieter, social, domestic kind of resonance, I guess.
Yeah, so dust, I mean, it's a material that I've always used, really. I used it as a student, and it's one of those materials that I go back to. I think when I started using dust, I was really interested in it as a forensic material. I was interested in it because it gathered in places, and it was very specific to places, and on a microscopic level, you could probably work out who'd been in that space, and that was my interest in that material. And I guess over time my interest has become more, dust has also got associations with time, a sense of time passing. It gathers on surfaces, it's got lots of connotations around the home and domestic labour, and particularly female labour. So I guess over time my relationship with it as a material has become more perhaps a bit more political, and a bit more certainly a bit more well, just enriched, really, I suppose, the more I've kind of used it, and in the different contexts that I've used it. And I think very early on I was always a little bit what's the word, kind of quite sort of nervous about making work that was kind of a bit feminist, or a bit you know, but it got to a point where I suppose I was an artist now, and I was making decorative domestic patterns using dust. It's like, when you have to talk about the feminist aspect of this, there is a feminist aspect here, you have to just kind of grow with it. And I guess that's something that I suppose as I've got older I've started to kind of explore more, and I guess my work's become more about dealing with sort of feminism, and not just necessarily feminism, but I think a lot of the work I do in the spaces that I work in is about the sort of hidden. It's about the hidden voices in those spaces, and the hidden stories and histories of those spaces, and a kind of frustration in how you only really get told often one particular narrative. And I guess what I'm interested in doing is like looking at the what's beneath that, and what are the other perspectives in those spaces. And
a work that I asked if we could bring up, because it's a very, very early work, like talking about something from 2002, but it was when I first, like we were similar age, so I first came across your work, was in a tower block in a project called Up in the Air, and I just raised it partly because I'm in Liverpool and I remember it from a certain time, which Leo Fitzmaurice and Neville Gaby had access to a tower block and a project with residents. And it was a particular time in Liverpool where the tower blocks had replaced terrace streets in the 60s, and by the 90s they were quite run down, but had very coherent communities, and communities that had been together for 30 years, but the tower blocks were changing, and there were a lot of projects happening at the time, including one called Tenant Spin, which were with the residents, how to kind of replace, they were going to go into low rise, which wasn't always the thing that they wanted to do, and as individuals they'd lived long and rich and varied lives, so they were part of this project. But I wonder if you might talk a little bit about that as a really early project, going in basically not long after graduation, to go into such a kind of loaded project, I guess, would be interesting.
Yeah, so I think it is, I mean, it's nearly 20 years ago, it was 2002, so and I was 3 years out of university, 3 years out of graduating, and so I mean the project, it was quite an amazing project. I don't think I have been involved in a project like it since. It seemed to kind of be like a kind of really, I don't know whether it was just the kind of context and the timing in that particular environment that just created this kind of really interesting moment. So there was 3 tower blocks, and I think when I moved in there was only 2 left, and they were all being demolished and these low-rise houses built. And the tower block that I was working in was called Linosa Close, I think, I remember that. And there was basically there was myself and about 8 other artists, and we spent a month, and we were given a flat to live in and a flat to work in. And so I essentially spent a month in a tower block in Liverpool. But part of the project, what was really nice about the project is it was really embedded with the community, but it wasn't sort of, I didn't have to do any workshops with the community. I just went and hung out with them in their community room and drank tea once a week and chatted and got to know them. And I think, and what was really interesting was, you know, these tower blocks, they were pretty shoddy because they hadn't really been looked after or maintained properly. But the people who lived in there for 30 years, you know, they really loved their houses. These were their homes. They brought their children up there. They had so many memories, and they really didn't want to let that go. And I suppose the work that I made is called If Walls Could Talk, and I was really sort of interested in I suppose in the fabric of the space, and how you know, what is history, what are, you know, if the building goes, you still have your memories, you still have that kind of the memory of that space. So kind of places can live beyond their physical form, I guess, is what I was kind of interested in. And how can you so the work was about the idea of scratching back through these kind of the paper on the walls to, in this kind of form of archaeology, I guess, and getting back to the original surface of the wall, but kind of thinking about the kind of lives lived in that space as well, I guess, and how they're kind of still in the air, still there and present. I mean, it feels quite strange talking about it because it is such an old work, but I suppose, I mean, I kind of, in a way, see, you know, working in that tab book in Liverpool, I was kind of working with history even then, even though it's a very different form of history to the kind of history of Temple Newsam, which is this 500-year-old Tudor Jacobean mansion. You know, it's still a kind of history that you're kind of working with. It's still telling a story about lives lived and maybe quiet voices as well.
Yeah, and only, as we know from certain times, only certain things are memorialised, only certain things are recognised. So that is, I think that aspect of yours that is the quiet and the domestic is really, really compelling. We were talking a little bit generally about how when you have children or caring responsibilities, you sort of start to shape a career in a particular way, and it goes for curators and everyone working in the arts. But would you at this point be interested in continuing working through sites, or those concerns that you've got, might they sit more autonomously now? Because we were saying pragmatically, site-specific commissions are one of the ways you get to make a living, and they have better fees than gallery commissions. They're often allowing a different amount of time, and they're really productive, and the ones you've done look incredibly resonant to your practice. But I was wondering at this point, if you've got any time to reflect, which is unlikely in your life at this moment, if you were coming back out, would you be looking for the kind of studio time or the site time at this moment?
Oh, I think I suppose it's always been both. I think so I've got 2 children. My eldest is 8.5 years old, and I think primarily since I've had children, because I had to sort of conflate a way of making money with making work, commissions seemed with a way that I could do that. And that's primarily what I've kind of, I suppose that's how I've continued to kind of make work and make a living. I think prior to that, I probably did, you know, I did. It feels like I did actually. I did make a lot of drawings that were very sort of labour intensive drawings. And I think the reality is that, you know, I can't spend 2 weeks working 12-hour days to make a single drawing anymore. I just don't have that time. But I think I suppose I see those things as going hand in hand. I suppose I am really interested in sites, but I think what's been interesting about the Temple Newsam project is it wasn't a brief. I wasn't working with a really brief. It was like, it came out of a conversation with a curator, and I had free reign, and that felt really exciting and also quite rare, because I think a lot of briefs tend to be quite specific, and it's possible to work with those. And I would only work on something if I found it interesting anyway. But I think it's almost like, I suppose it's given me a taste of that. What did you do when you have free reign? And I guess that's what I'd quite like to kind of do more of. And I suppose I see maybe the studio as possibly, you know, sort of making work. It's not really about the studio even. It's more about being independent. I guess it's more about that kind of independent research and that independent autonomous kind of going where you want to go, where your ideas take you, rather than having to put them in a box and pitch them to someone and fix an idea in stone, which I guess is the commissioning process is sometimes like that. So I think my work is fundamentally always about responding to history in some way. So I guess that's always going to be there. And I kind of feel, in a way, it's quite frustrating with the coronavirus and lockdown, because I just kind of felt quite energized by the work I'd made, and that I did feel like I was kind of doing something a little bit new for me. And then I just felt like that sort of energy, that kind of momentum is just kind of almost in like suspended animation right now while life is like this. So I'm hoping that once it's all gone down, I'll be able to pick that up again. But I suppose it's who knows what's going to be there to, you know, who knows what is going to be left what's going to come out of this in terms of what the cultural sector is going to look like when this is all over.
Yeah. Because you're teaching remotely, aren't you, as well at the moment, which is...
Yeah. I do, yeah. I teach at Newcastle University on the final year, but again, I don't know whether I'll get any teaching work next year because it's going to depend on student numbers and all that kind of thing. So everything feels very up in the air. I mean, I guess the thing is, I know that I will always make work, and you don't have to make, you know, I kind of say this to my students all the time and have been saying it to them a lot recently, because obviously they all had these huge ambitious degree shows planned, and then suddenly they're working in their bedrooms. And so I think, and I've heard myself say to them a number of times that, you know, you don't have to make work, doesn't have to be big to be good. You know, it's about the content and the ideas and what you're trying to say. So I guess and sometimes I think I need to listen to my own advice sometimes, you know, that you can make work. I suppose, like, I don't know whether Mars could show the Sad Bones pieces, which they were made actually, interestingly, in between. I think I started making those when I think in between having my two children. So I was kind of just coming out of sort of one maternity leave and about to go into another, probably. But I mean, these are just pages from a book of photographs from magazines of buildings that no longer exist, and I just set the fireplaces on fire. So they're sort of, I was kind of interested in the idea of making them real again, just for a moment, by setting them alight. And I guess they're quite immediate works, they're quite quick works. So I think, you know, there is ways to make work that sort of speaks the same, that's dealing with the same sort of approach to space, or the same ideas, the same content, that doesn't have to be, you know, me spending 2 weeks, 3 weeks kneeling on the floor making something out of salt. You know, you can make something a bit more immediate than that. Yeah. And that's still valid and valuable.
We were actually talking, in a way, if you'd sent me the site Below the Sultan about Temple Newsam, if I hadn't looked closely, I would have imagined the project had happened, because it's so kind of beautifully documented. But there is a work as yet incomplete, and we were talking about how strange it is that actually there is something in realising a work, in people coming in its reception, in that moment of reflecting afterwards. But should that be possible, do you think, if all other factors being possible, that it is possible to go back in? Have you got that space to kind of pick up that sculpture and think about how you kind of carry on that project to finish?
It does feel quite strange, because the work, so lockdown was the 23rd of March, wasn't it, something like that, and the show was due to open on the 4th of April. So it's so in a way the film exists, the photographs exist, although they're still actually at the framers. I don't know what state the build was in at the museum. So there's all this. It feels like sort of unfinished business in a way. It's not. It's an exhibition that's never sort of fully come to fruition. And it sort of feels quite abstract, I guess. And it feels like, I suppose it is a long time, isn't it? That's quite a long time. You know, we're in June now. And I just had to down tools with the sculpture, because it was kind of, I was making it, and then the kids' schools closed, and then I just realised that I just couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. There's just no way I could do it. And I did bring the work home, and it did sit in the corner of the lounge, and I just did not have time to pick it up and start working on it. And then it was going to start, I could see it getting damaged. So I just kind of took it back to my studio. And I don't know, it does feel slightly strange, the idea of going back to making something. And I guess because I was in that kind of process of intense process of being working on a project for quite a period. You know, I've been working on it for about 4 or 5 months, and it's quite, you kind of get a momentum and an energy about it, and then suddenly it's like, oh, so I don't know whether I'll have to really, I don't know, not dig deep, but think about what it is that I was trying to do.
Or it might be different as you come back to it.
It might be different, yeah.
Miles is going to move us on to some questions, because they've been flying in. I can see they've been flying in. So it's a chance to hear from people watching.
We've got some really great questions. So, and we've got 15 minutes left, roughly. So I'm going to go straight into it. So this is from Rachel Rich. Catherine, you have described the dancers in the Below the Salt film as proxies for yourself. In an earlier work, you used yourself as a sort of proxy for wealthy women. trapped in their beautiful domestic interior, do you feel equally empathetic with the women upstairs and downstairs? Do you think that the ability to think of women's labour across class boundaries is important to the work you make and to your history?
Oh, I missed the end of that question, Miles.
Oh, right.
See if I can see them.
So the questions were, do you feel equally empathetic with the women upstairs and downstairs? And do you think that the ability to think of women's labour across class boundaries is important to the work you make and to your understanding of history?
So just to explain, Rachel is the historian that I worked with at Leeds, Beckett University. So yes, just say that. Yeah, I suppose I have. So where to start? I suppose I don't really think about. Do I think about class boundaries? I suppose there is a really obvious distinction between, in those kind of historic houses, between class, between working class, which is downstairs, and upper class, which is upstairs. But I still think there's kind of, there's still a kind of, I suppose what I'm interested in is that even women in the upstairs were kind of voiceless in a way. So they might have had a very different life experience to those below stairs, but they were still, you know, kind of quite sort of marginalized in some ways, although quite a sort of different way. And I think again, I'd say my interest in that kind of giving a voice to people that don't have a voice within those kind of environments. So whether that's, you know, the servant downstairs who's just completely anonymous and working all day, or whether it's the kind of the woman who's completely got no control over the choices in her life because she's kind of expected to behave and be and live in a certain way. I guess they're still sort of both trapped in the same space, but in a very different way. I don't know whether that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it very much does. So moving on to the next question. I mean, Rachel is not able to respond very quickly to your question back to her. So I'm just going to cut straight into another question from Daniel Goodman. Catherine, I really enjoy how in your work I get the sense of space and buildings not as a fixed thing, but as something which changes over time through its various uses by different people. Does the temporary nature of your work and materials you use have a connection with the idea of space as a shifting thing? Do you see your interventions in those spaces as a way of writing yourself into history?
I think the fleeting nature of the installations has always been quite important. So I think, it is about that sense of that the works themselves become history. So they just become moments in time, and allowing that kind of almost not holding on to that. They just become what they go. And I think some people find that really difficult. Whenever I do talks, I quite often, particularly with students, get quite horrified at the idea that your work would just get destroyed. But I think there's something quite important about the fact that the work does disappear and almost become a moment in history. Is that about me putting myself into history? I don't know whether it's necessarily about me, but maybe it's about me sort of bringing, I suppose it's me bringing maybe other voices out of history, like shining a light on parts of history that have not been addressed or looked at or noticed or discussed. So I think maybe it's not necessarily about me, it's maybe about the people that I'm trying to kind of I'm not speaking for anybody, but the people that I'm trying to, that I'm making work about, I suppose.
Right, I'm just trying to find the next question. Sorry, I did a little screen share there because I thought it would be quite nice to watch your film while we're asking questions, but it means I've lost lost the questions. So I'm going to stop doing that and move straight back. Stop share. Right. Okay. Here we go. This is from Bruce Haynes. Catherine, I wonder, do you think not having to make stuff, particularly as going to market is impossible, online viewing rooms don't work, etc., might bring you back to the more contingent and ephemeral as a sufficient gesture? I loved the short film as a 9-year-old boy, by the way.
It's not having to make stuff. I don't know. I suppose I don't know. I suppose I don't really think about. Oh, it's a really hard question. I think my work. I suppose what I try to do with the work I make is make it what it needs to be. So I don't try to think about in a way what it could be. So maybe this question is really about when I was talking about like there have been some sort of legacy, and I think the legacy is not really it's not really about me having something to sell. It's really about me kind of in a real practical way and real pragmatic way. Like I can't make work I can't be as prolific as I was 20 years ago because I just don't have the time anymore because I have a family to look after. So how can it's about me maybe making my work more visible or giving my work more opportunity to be visible, perhaps, by making things that can maybe exist in a slightly different way than the kind of ephemeral work that I've made in the past. So I suppose it's me trying to think about, maybe it's about me trying to think about perhaps how the work can be historicised in some way. Is about that kind of how can there maybe some lasting objects come out of these fleeting commissions. I don't know. I suppose it's just something I grapple with as an artist in a really, it's trying to think about, I suppose in a way what happens when I'm not here, what is there, what's left of my work. And I guess as someone that deals in history and archives and delving into that stuff all the time, it's like, what am I leaving behind? What's the trace of my presence? And maybe I'm trying to maybe that's what I'm trying to explore with this sense of making the works kind of exist outside of those fleeting temporary installations. That was quite morbid, wasn't it?
Chris Currell asks, what are you looking for when you delve into the past?
What do I look for?
What are you looking for?
What am I looking for?
Slightly different.
I suppose I think I was kind of thinking about this a lot, really, and it's kind of like, I suppose what I kind of think looking back at history is really important. It's like, it's how you make sense of where we are today, isn't it? If you think about, oh God, I mean, so many things that are going on at the moment, to understand, the current pandemic that we're in, it's like really important to look back at, the Spanish flu that happened 100 years ago so like that idea of like looking back to kind of try and make sense of where you are, and also to try and think about maybe where things went wrong and what can we do to make things better for the future. So I think when I'm looking back at the past, I suppose what I'm looking at is maybe trying to think about how we can make things better, or what do we need to kind of look at to try and improve things for people. And I suppose a lot of that is maybe me thinking about myself as a woman, like what would make life better for women, but also it extends beyond that as well, I guess, in some way.
So Lisa Watts says, just a simple question. Could you describe the texture and surface of your salt photos, as I can't quite tell from the screen? Your work is fantastic, by the way.
Thank you. So I used a table salt, like just a really fine table salt, and it was made by, I put the salt was just like coated onto the floor, so just kind of like there's just a layer of it, probably about 3 to 5 millimeters thick, and then I cut out stencils and they were sort of put on top, and then it was brushed away. and then the stencils were carefully lifted off. So the kind of surface of the salt was slightly, because the stencils had been on top, was slightly compressed. And also because the floor was very uneven, it was kind of thicker in some parts than others. So there probably are some maybe other photographs on the website, Miles, that you might be able to.
Yeah, which one? Sorry,
I don't know whether you've got enough detailed shots actually.
And when you develop the photographs, actually up through the salt process, how is their surface, or sort of, I mean, or how do you control the kind of matte or effect of that?
It was a really so I actually worked with an artist called Leah Miller, and she helped me in the darkroom, and we spent probably 3 times longer than I planned in the darkroom, because it was just a really tricky process. It's really temperamental, so you have to use a very sort of quite heavy duty, like almost like watercolor paper, and we used salt mixed with gelatin. So the gelatin slightly makes the sort of image sit on the surface a little bit more, but you do get the sort of texture of the paper coming through. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's kind of quite an amazing process, because it is almost like the image is soaked into the paper. Then they're completely matte. The gelatin gives it a little bit of a sort of sheen, but they're very sort of matte. And they're very sort of, they're very, what's the word? Like they kind of feel like an object. They feel like they're very sculptural, I think, is what they are. They're not just an image. They become like a thing in themselves. They have their own sort of physicality to them, which is why I do see them as kind of like an object rather than just a kind of photographic image, because they just do have this real sort of physical presence in a way.
I've just found a whole load more questions hidden in a different part of Zoom. So this question, this is a good one. This is from anonymous attendee. I have an issue with the term of performance being used so liberally, when what I had witnessed was a choreographed dance to camera piece located at the site. Whilst it was performative, it is too refined to these practice performers working to the exact nature of the choreographed score. Would you say that by making something so refined and graceful, it idealizes the dancers more than the awkward, cumbersome space itself that would have been occupied and passed through by bodies that were overworked, stressed, and less glamorous due to the roles and positions of the workers?
Oh, I'm going to have to read that question myself. I can't take that all in.
Yeah.
Is it there?
I don't think. Hang on, let me.
I mean, I think there's kind of. I suppose it's.
I think the question is about the idea of performance and choreography, and whether, in some way, it glamorizes something where living quite a different sort of would have had quite a different feel. I guess using dancers kind of shifts something away to a different space.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is. I mean, it's kind of like, I suppose there's kind of lots of maybe crossing over of disciplines, isn't there? Because I'm not a choreographer. I'm not a dancer, and I'm not used. I'm sure there's a whole like area of discourse around that I'm maybe not that attuned to, because it's not something that I'm massively experienced in or know that enough about yet. So does it glamorize them? I mean, I was trying not to be about, I don't know. I mean, I guess, I don't know, maybe there is another way to do it. Maybe it could have been shot differently. I, I don't know, I suppose what I was interested in about was the kind of it's not just about them working in space, but there's also, I don't know whether people could hear, but there was the soundtrack for the film was actually the sound of clocks recorded from the house, which was made into this kind of composition. And so as much as it was about people in that space, it was also about kind of time and the passing of time. And I kind of was quite interested in parts of the film where they start to look a bit like they're kind of like clockwork and becoming almost like a kind of they're sort of almost becoming like clocks or like cogs in a clock or something. The dancers become quite mechanical.
We spoke a little bit about that has a history. So you have Maya Hold's movements for factory workers, and then it kind of goes into Busby Berkeley, but there's kind of different avant-garde kind of traditions of realism versus like a kind of symbolical or mechanical movement. So you were talking a bit about, the body reflecting in a more abstract way time rather than acting out time. So that was something I took from it, definitely.
Yeah.
Just cutting in here again, there's a question from Neil Armstrong. What do you feel about monuments? Should they always be temporary?
What do I think about monuments? Should they always be what?
What do you feel about monuments? Should they always be temporary? And I guess there's obviously...
Yeah, should they always be temporary? Maybe they should always be temporary, but I suppose it's maybe always questioning, isn't it? It's always questioning what you receive to be true, I suppose. So, and I think if sort of, and it was on my mind today as well about the statue in Bristol being pulled down, and that sense of that's it is part of Liverpool, of Bristol's history, but it's also part of lots of other people's history, and it's really important that history's not static. I suppose that's kind of ultimately it, isn't it? History's not a static thing, and it's not. It's something that shifts and changes depending on your perspective and depending on your position. And I guess it's important to kind of always acknowledge that everyone will have a slightly different take on history, and so maybe it's not necessarily the monument, but maybe it's the way we talk about that, or the way that's maybe monuments don't have to be temporary, but maybe they have to be constantly, the narratives around them have to shift to reflect different people's kind of perceptions of that moment of time that they're representing, perhaps.
And also the fact that we're still in terms of school curriculum stuck with like the Victorians' own view of empire and all the legacies. So it's about how you, in the 21st century, move those narratives on, that you're not stuck in this very positivist view of the kind of Georgian Victorian era, which you never get still in schools. It hasn't changed. So there's that whole discourse that David Olusoga's kind of talking about with the statue, about what needs to be known, as well as what kind of statues stand for. So yeah, it's quite a week. There was always a very strange reenactment of a kind of veneration of Colston that was incredibly problematic, as well as the statue in Bristol. It was a very, very strange phenomena.
On that note, I think we should end, and I just want to thank you both, Catherine Bertola and Marianne McQuay, for a really wonderful and enlightening talk. Really fantastic. It was a joy to watch and tinker around with images in the background for. So thank you very much, and thank you everybody who attended, and we hope that you can join us next Tuesday, same time, to be in conversation with Magnus Quaife and Andy Hunt. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll all say goodbye and do that thing at the end.
Do a Zoom wave.
Try and find the end button. Okay, thanks everyone. Bye-bye.